This is the second part of this manhwa. If you haven't seen the previous chapters, I recommend that you do so. People begin to surround the protagonist to protect the children and try to get him off his horse while he says he didn't do anything wrong. The children escape through an alley and say they will now get a lot of money from their young master. When Shelly appears with one of her subordinates and captures one of them, she asks him who that young master is. We then see that the citizens are humiliating the protagonist, making him walk with a sign that says he is a bad knight, just like his cat. They say they will take him to the castle so that Iron can judge him and kick him out of the order, but Shelly appears blocking their way. She asks them why so many of them are gathered and they tell her they are punishing the knight who intimidated her. But she tells them they are mistaken because the protagonist only helped her. Then the citizen tells her that his mother saw him harassing a girl, so Shelly asks to see her. She steps forward and tells Shelly not to be intimidated by that swindling knight. When the noblewoman removes her wig, revealing that she is a boy, it surprises the citizens. She tells them they were fooled by children and tells her subordinate to take the others as well. People see that they are the same children who shouted for help, and Shelly explains that they are just victims of rumors against the protagonist, and that they played the prank themselves, which they admit. There the citizens understand that they blamed the wrong person, so they release the protagonist. But Shelly tells them that, by naming him a knight, Iron granted the protagonist the title of Baron. So they just insulted a nobleman, and he has the right to sanction them. The citizens say they are not guilty because they really didn't know, but the protagonist says he will sanction them because they insulted his honor as a knight. So the people are scared, and they beg him to forgive them. He tells them it's too late, and they must pay for it, as forgiveness is not something that perpetrators can talk about. Then he rewrites the sign they made him hold, which now says he is a good knight. And he tells them to walk with that sign where they made him walk, and he will forgive them. Shelly begins to laugh and says the protagonist is very funny, while the citizens ask if he will really forgive them if they do that. To which the protagonist responds yes, because a knight is always a man of his word. So they start fighting to go first and decide to go all together. While we see Felder and Matthew watching the scene from above, and the former asks his subordinate if that's what happens when they give him another chance. In a change of scene, the protagonist thanks Shelly for helping him resolve the misunderstanding. She tells him that she was just returning the favor, but warns him that Matthew was the one who accused him in order to distance him from Iron. Therefore, he should investigate Matthew. The cat finds the noble's intentions suspicious, so he tells the protagonist to ask why she is telling him this. The protagonist does, and although Shelly says that it could bring her family closer to Iron, he finds it amusing, so it's okay to tell him. As Shelly starts to leave to go to the theater, the protagonist sees someone coming out of the alley and grabbing Shelly. It turns out to be Matthew, who tells them not to come closer or he will kill her. He explains that he had done everything to keep Shelly out of the war, but by helping the protagonist, his lord abandoned him. And if he can't sow discord, he could eliminate the protagonist, which would make Felder happy. Matthew tells the protagonist that he will let Shelly go if he tears off an arm and a leg, or else he will kill her. Shelly thinks the protagonist won't do it because he's not his subordinate, and Matthew mocks him for it. But then the protagonist agrees and rips off his arm and says that he hopes Matthew keeps his word. This surprises everyone, and Matthew calls him a true lunatic. But the protagonist says he's not crazy. He's a knight and throws his arm at Matthew, knocking him down. Shelly's guards take advantage of the opportunity and immobilize the noble. Shelly realizes that the arm is an empty armor, which the protagonist explains by saying that he retracted his arm inside the armor. Shelly thanks him again for saving her life, but Matthew laughs because they are not yet safe. Because, by helping the protagonist, the Gregory family is now in trouble. He says that when the time comes, he will be crying over his grandfather's corpse, while we see some bandits arriving at his mansion. Gregory wakes up and finds himself surrounded by bandits who raided his house and killed his guards. They say they have a lot of time to talk about it, to which Gregory asks what they want to talk about. The bandit leader is surprised that he doesn't ask who they are and what they want. Gregory responds that it doesn't matter because he doesn't believe they're there to kill him. The leader tells him that he doesn't want to talk to him either and throws a dagger at him, narrowly missing his head. He tells Gregory he needs to write a letter to his fiefdom to send troops to support the Betchers against the king. However, Gregory realizes they are not men from Iron. The leader says it doesn't matter and he just needs to write the letter. But Gregory refuses again, which angers the leader, who threatens to kill him and everyone in the mansion if he doesn't comply. Gregory then tells him to go ahead and do it, as he won't have his seals, and his son will inherit his title through a will in which not even the king can interfere. He also asks how Felder could send a man like him to kidnap him. The leader is surprised that Gregory knows who is behind the attack. In a change of scene, we see Iron and Felder discussing the distribution of their troops in the castle. When a guard enters and says that Felder has a messenger outside the castle, he goes out to meet him. But Iron suspects something, so she asks Horace to follow her uncle's messenger with a group of men. Felder reads in the message that Gregory realized it was him, so he tells the bandits to continue as instructed. The nobleman returns to Iron, and she asks him what happened. He responds that nothing serious happened, just affairs of his fiefdom. But she tells him that, due to the war, the city is under martial law, and the city gates do not open at night without her order, so she questions how his messenger entered the city. Back at the mansion, the bandits are waiting for the messenger, but instead of him, Shelly arrives. She enters the mansion with the protagonist's cat and complains that no one received her, when we see the bandit boss waiting for her behind the door. The bandits gag the girl and throw her next to Gregory, saying she's a gift from heaven. The boss tells the noble that he's a tough nut to crack. But with his granddaughter it's different because everyone in the city knows how much he spoils her. He asks what would happen to her if she refuses to write the letter, which angers Gregory. The bandit takes Shelly and asks Gregory what he can do if something happens to her at that moment. He then removes the gag from the girl so she can speak, saying that torture is not fun without screams. But she just sticks her tongue out and says it's obvious he's not good at threatening anyone, as his threats are too weak. So the bandit gets angry and hits her, telling Shelly that he'll see if his threats work or not. And she asks him why he doesn't try, while we see the cat behind the boss. The cat jumps to scratch him and suddenly activates a magic circle. A few moments earlier, we see Shelly and the protagonist arrive at the mansion, but because of the lack of light, the girl says something's wrong. The protagonist then suggests they enter to save them, but Shelly tells him not to, because the mansion has too many rooms, so they must first determine where her grandfather is. Then the protagonist asks what they should do, and Shelly tells him to let her enter alone, and when the time comes, he should find a way to follow her secretly. The protagonist tells her it will be difficult because of his armor, but if she finds Gregory's location, she can go there directly if she has the cat with her. He says it won't give him time to run and tell him, but the protagonist doesn't mean that and gives him a collar. He says it's the disposable amulet he stole from the Great Lich, which should only be hung around his neck and hit against the ground while shouting his name to summon it. And when we return to the present, we see the protagonist appearing in front of the bandits, who say there's no room for a single shadow in every corner where the sun shines. And he sanctions them in the name of the Holy Spirit, making the angel sneeze, who is a messenger of the Holy Spirit that usually passes by there. One of the bandits warns the boss that it's the protagonist, but he says he's alone, so they can take him down together. One of the bandits attacks the protagonist, but he barely grazes his armor and sends him flying with a single blow. The boss tells them not to be afraid, as he only has physical strength and they will win when they surround him and take the hostage. But the protagonist says that he will win, and with a single blow, he blocks the boss's attack. The boss complains of the pain in his hand when he realizes that the protagonist has just tied him up with magic chains, called chains of luminous beams, with which in one motion he captures the rest of the bandits. Moments later, Shelly and her grandfather wonder if they are okay, and the nobleman reflects that the protagonist's abilities were magic, and that the only human in the world who can freely use it is the Paladin of the Holy Order. So he thinks they should re-examine the Becher family, as they could have requested the favor of the Holy Order. The protagonist asks Shelly what they should do with the bandits, and she tells him she will take care of them. First, she asks the boss if his name is Eddie Daniel, and he is surprised that she knows. She also tells him that she knows about his family and where they live, so Eddie tells her not to harm them. But Shelly tells him that she has nothing against them, but the person who sent them could do it when they find out they failed. So she offers them two options. The first is to reveal who sent them, while the second is for them to die to erase the evidence and their families not to be implicated. And Eddie says that going against that man will bring death to his family, so he asks Shelly to keep her promise not to attack his family, and suddenly dies. So Shelly concludes that he bit the poison capsule in his teeth. Then Shelly sees her grandfather paying attention to the window, so she asks him what's going on. And he says that the Becher family has come to pick them up, as we see the arrival of the Knights of Iron, who says that she is fast in her actions, as it seems they followed the messenger who contacted Felder. So they must leave to not make them wait, as it is time to go talk to her. Iron asks Felder if he wants to explain something to her, but he says no, just that some people need to feel pain to make the right decision. Iron tells him that she didn't give him permission to do so, but Felder says that she didn't object either, and even thanked him for his guidance. She looks at him coldly, and Felder tells her that supporting her is a risk, and since he helped her when she was weak, she should be grateful to him. She says she learned her lesson. Moments later, Abby complains to Iron and asks how Fedler dares to ask for thanks after all he's done. But Iron tells her to calm down, as hitting him now could provoke the other forces that have united against them. She asks how Count Gregory is doing, and the guard responds that he's doing well thanks to the protagonist, who was also targeted by Felder and managed to find the Count by following clues. Iron meets with Gregory, and he asks her if she argued with Felder. She says yes and tells him what he said, but that she couldn't make a move against him, and she's worried that he might be a rat for the king. But the Count tells her it's not that simple, and if he had wanted to lay his hands on him, he would have caused disturbances so that the king would send troops. He asks her how she suspected him so quickly. Then Iron tells him that Felder took his son Jimmy with him, but he has white hair like only the Betcher have, so she suspects he's the bastard son that the king found. And they can only wait and see how events unfold. We then see Felder enter a room in the castle where Jimmy is, and he asks him how he dares to come to him at that time of day. Felder then kneels and apologizes, calling him his lord. The boy tells him there's no problem and asks him what happened for him to ask for his help. There, the noble tells him that the protagonist has sabotaged his plans from the beginning at the port of Hamlet, that he's someone strange that no one knows where he comes from and acts like a child, but he's also very strong and brave, as well as loyal to Iron. Jimmy understands then that the noble wants the protagonist to disappear, and says he'll help him because he's also curious about him. While we see him release a horde of bats, and that he also has wings. Suddenly we see that one of the bats is caught by the angel, who requests permission to eliminate Jimmy, who says he's an underage vampire. But her contact tells her she can only watch and not do anything, as she must act according to protocol until the other side kills a human. And she responds that too many deviants are appearing, and she has a feeling they will gather more in the city. Iron meets with Felder and Gregory and asks for their opinion on the deployment of the defensive line for the battle. Felder suggests that with Gregory's army, they can expand the line, and Gregory agrees, as long as they don't place his army with Felder's rogue soldiers. He fears that Felder might stab him in the back during the battle, but Felder believes that he should be willing to do so if he is going to fight on their side. Just then, Jimmy arrives and complains to Felder that he hasn't played with him, but Felder tells him he can't. The boy then asks to play with the protagonist. In a scene change, the protagonist asks why they are going to the underground instead of playing, and Jimmy tells him not to worry. When they arrive, he welcomes them to the underground playground where no one will bother them. However, Shelly appears behind the protagonist and asks why they are there to play. Jimmy becomes upset and tells her that he only invited the protagonist, and she came on her own. She explains that she was bored and suggests they all play together. Jimmy agrees and proposes they play the game of the Brave and the Dragon, in which a wicked dragon has kidnapped the princess, and the Brave emerges to kill the monster. Suddenly, Jimmy uses a skill called the Illusionist's Eye, which hypnotizes the group. He tells Shelly that she is the Brave, while the protagonist is the Dragon, mortal enemies who will fight each other for the princess. The protagonist then asks if he can be the Brave instead, as it is a more suitable role for a knight. Jimmy realizes his hypnosis didn't work on him. The cat then hits the protagonist and tells him he is only his mount, the Lord Dragon. Jimmy thinks he targeted the wrong person and tries to hypnotize the protagonist again, but he remains unaffected. Shelly appears behind Jimmy with a brick, calling him princess and telling him to back off. Jimmy realizes it's because of the story he told before the hypnosis, and Shelly brutally beats up the protagonist. When she defeats him, she tells him to go back to the castle with a terrifying expression that scares Jimmy. He screams for her to leave and for someone to come quickly to help him. In a change of scene, the doctors are urgently called, and we see Shelly and the cat lying on a bed. Meanwhile, Iron asks the protagonist why Shelly fell into a coma after going out with them. The protagonist tells her that he doesn't know the reason, but the doctors say that they were affected by black magic, which requires a priest for treatment. This makes him wonder if it was Jimmy, and why the protagonist is fine. Abby says that maybe it's because the protagonist has the protection of the Holy Spirit, and Iron thinks that he should be able to take care of Jimmy then. In a change of scene, we see a vampire girl named Dora arrive with Jimmy, who is actually named Jones, as she brought him food, but she finds him crying under a blanket and says that she will beat up whoever intimidated him. Jones tells her to be quiet, and that his discomfort is because a human threatened him with a brick and hugged him in public. So he is going to take revenge because if it weren't for Felder, he wouldn't be in that situation. Plus, if he does anything else, Iron will suspect him. Dora says that it's not that complicated, as she just has to order him to kill whoever he needs to. But he scolds her and says that they can't kill people because of the agreement with the angels. who are probably already watching them for their actions. Then we see the angel named Catherine draw her sword, and her supervisor tells her not to be impulsive, but she says she's just cleaning it. Dora asks what they should do, and Jones says that he already planned how to get rid of the protagonist while drinking his blood. But suddenly he spits it out because it smells like wine, and it's because she extracted it from a drunk, who are the only ones who wouldn't suspect the injury. And he tells her that maybe she should bring him pig's blood instead, which makes the boy feel bad because he is of true blood, and says to just wait, as he will revive the great blood race. But the next day we see the protagonist in his room, where he was ordered to play with Jones, and this time they will play a familiar game where the protagonist will be the father and Jones the son. And he tells him that they will go for a walk in the sun, while Jones faints from his skin contact. In a scene change, we see Jones in armor riding down the street with the protagonist. People greet the protagonist, and Jones wonders how he ended up in this situation. Then we see that the protagonist apologized to Jones, as he didn't know the sun affected him, but they had to go out for the game. Jones tells him to leave his room and leave him alone, but the protagonist says he can't, as Iron asked him to play with him all day. So a legendary incident awaits them outside. Jones asks him why he listens to everything she says, when suddenly the protagonist punches a hole in the wall. He tells Jones that Iron told him it was okay to hit the boy if he didn't listen, so he accepted in terror. Back in the present, Jones tells him in his mind to wait and he'll be in trouble in a couple of days. Then we see the children who ambush the protagonist hiding in an alley when he sees them. They think he discovered them, but the protagonist only tells them not to go into alleys, as they could be in danger. This moves one of them, who finally apologizes to the protagonist for what they did. He tells him that they are orphans adopted by the church, which ran out of money due to the war, and they accepted the job to help the father. But the protagonist donated all his fortune to them when he found out, instead of punishing them, so they have great respect for him. The protagonist tells them that he only did what any knight would do, but they tell him that he was the only one who did it, so they vowed to become knights when they grew up. To which the protagonist says why wait for them to grow up, and that they should join him now to form a knight order. So he takes them to the church to give them their title, while they ask him about Jones, and he tells them he's his temporary adopted son. And they say they also want to be his true sons, and he tells them that from that day on, they all are. The group arrives at the church, and the protagonist makes the request to the father, who thinks they are playing and lets them in. However, he says that someone is praying and they will have to wait a bit. And then the person introduces herself as Catherine, who tells him that it is the first time they have met. And the protagonist recognizes the special vibes she emits. The group of boys recites the knight's oath in front of the protagonist, who, upon finishing, accepts their loyalty and grants them the sacred title, as well as the promise that he will take care of them for life as long as they do not break their oath. The boys begin to celebrate, but the protagonist tells them not to get too excited yet because they are only apprentices, and while he gets them armor and horses, they need to think of a name for their order as well as a banner. They call him a very considerate leader, but he tells them that as their leader, they should now call him captain. However, he senses Catherine's presence and falls silent. The protagonist thinks that he will not regret the path he has chosen, and although he was prepared, he did not expect the moment to come so soon because he had no doubt that Catherine was an angel. The protagonist begins to think about what he should do, but she tells him that she will not harm him because he is not hurting anyone and she is just curious to talk to him. The protagonist then sits next to her and Catherine asks him why he wants to be a knight. He responds with excitement that it's great and he loves the respect he receives from people. Catherine suspects him and tells him that the path of the knight is not easy because he can lose that respect, and his lord may start to question him, which will make him miserable. As she leaves, the protagonist thinks he doesn't understand how that could happen, and Irene is a good lady, so Catherine should know her first before talking to him. Then the father stops him and thanks him for his help, as the children have stopped being mischievous and have started reading the sacred book on their own. So, he should be recognized by the Holy Order, which excites the protagonist, who asks if he could help him get that seal. The father tells him yes, but the rest of the church left him alone to take care of the children because of the war, and he can only continue to do so if he keeps providing financial assistance. So the protagonist understands that he needs money and says he will go to the tavern. At night, we see Dora finding Jones emaciated and asking him what happened. He tells her everything the protagonist made him do, from forcing him to play and break the wall to entering a church. But Dora mocks him, which saddens Jones, and she gives him a hug to comfort him. Then Dora tells him that if he is so aggrieved, they should just ask the king to send troops. but he says he cannot take the country by force and will resist everything for the renaissance of the blood race. At the tavern, some diners say that the protagonist has skill, while we see him win another game, with which he obtains a sack of coins. But as he is about to leave, a drunk interrupts him and asks for 100 silver coins, which the protagonist gives him. Some boys see the scene and also ask the protagonist for money, saying they have sick relatives. And we see that the protagonist was giving money until dawn, so he thinks he needs to get more money to help everyone. He only had 2 silver coins left for his father. When he returns to the church, the boys tell him they already have a name for the order, which is the Super Invincible Order of the Silver Moon Lord. In addition, they worked all night on the order's flag. This makes the protagonist proud, who says it's great, and they'll start training to be the #1 knights in the city. One of the boys asks him about Jimmy, and the protagonist says he forgot, but he'll go home and bring him with him. Later we see Dora finding Jones emaciated again. He tells her that the protagonist forced him to learn horseback riding under the sun. Then he taught him fencing, although his technique was worse than his own. And then he had to study novels of knights, dance, and housework, in which he discovered that the protagonist has an obsession with women's clothing. So he tells Dora to ask the king for help, or else he'll be killed by the protagonist. She asks him if he didn't say he wouldn't take the duchy by force, but he says the situation has changed, and if they torture him to death, then what's the point of getting the duchy? So Dora transforms and says she'll prepare everything. Later, a messenger announces that the king has summoned his lords to gather their troops in the capital. Dora finds Jones depressed again, so she asks the king for help, and another messenger announces that he will gather his troops on the border of the Becher Duchy. And Dora finds Jones in a bad state again, so the messenger announces that the king has made his troops cross through the swamp during the rainy season. So Irene asks her uncles what they think, and Felder says the king must be confused. We see the king with his army, who tells Dora that they have already reached the maximum march speed and that under those conditions, they will not be able to fight. But Dora asks him if he doesn't want immortality, and the king says that he will find a way to accelerate the march. Irene puts on her armor when Abby tells her that the warriors have already gathered. She goes out to the castle and stands in front of her troops, telling them that the king intends to plunder their land by despicable means, and that they should prepare for battle. Suddenly, something catches Horace's attention, who sees a group of children dressed as soldiers among the troops and asks what they are doing there. Then a soldier tells him that they were brought by the Prota and they are members of his order. They confirm that it is true. Moments later, we see the Prota with the children entering Iron's office, who asks if they are the children he recruited, to which he says yes. Horace then asks if he intends to send them to fight with their parents' consent. But they tell him not to worry because they are all orphans and will become guardians of the knights. This leaves Iron speechless, and she tells him that she wants to speak to their leader alone. But when they leave, she tells the Prota to return the children to the church because they may become good knights in the future, and she cannot let them fight that battle as they could die in the war. The Prota says that as long as he is there, no one will hurt them, but she asks him if he knows what war is, and he tells her that it is where a knight builds his merit. It says that it is where life and death meet, where knights born in poverty make their names, and where all those who crave merit and glory thrive. Later on, we see the stables, where Tenidos asks the protagonist how long he will hide there. The protagonist says he angered Iron, who told him to find a place to reflect on his actions. Since the cat hasn't woken up, he asks to stay for a while. Tenidos is surprised that the protagonist made Iron angry with his great character, and asks him to tell him what happened. However, the protagonist says it's not a pleasant memory. There, we see the protagonist's memories, where Iron angrily asks him if merit and fame are all that matters to him. She tells him that if he wants to build a career with greater renown, she won't stop him, but he shouldn't involve children in his arrogant desire for glory. She says that the battlefield means bloodshed and sacrifice, and the reason for taking up their swords and fighting is to prevent their children from going to war. However, the protagonist says they are no longer children but good knights who still have room to grow, and he can protect them in battle so that they can help her win the war, and she won't have to worry. But this only makes her angrier, and she asks him how he will protect them when 10,000 people come at him. They will be defenseless, and since they can't protect themselves, death awaits them. To this, the protagonist responds that death is not terrible and should not be feared, and even if they die, he could bring them back to life. This only angers her more. Back in the present, the protagonist says that's when he told him to leave and reflect, and Tenidos says he understands Iron's anger. He asks the protagonist if he knows what it means to be alive, and he asks if Tenidos is alive at that moment. Tenidos says no because when you are alive, you can eat, but the undead do not need to do that, only burn fire. And if you're alive, you can eat, smell, and feel something that an undead cannot do even if they are conscious. The protagonist says he thinks he understands what he means and asks what he should do to understand it properly. Tenidos suggests he visit a tavern and use magic to taste the food and become addicted to it. So they both set off to experience what it means to be alive. But on the way, they come across the drunkard and his wife, who asks him not to gamble again because it's all they have left. In addition, they are in debt, and he has already lost 2 fingers because of it. The old man says he will turn things around and will hit her if she doesn't let him. The protagonist intervenes, but the old man says it was all his fault for giving him so much money, and he must compensate with more. The protagonist says he will, but the wife says he shouldn't because they might kill him this time. So the protagonist offers the 2 silver coins he has left, but the man says it's not enough. Meanwhile, the protagonist wonders what he's doing and that it's not the same as the knight in his book. The messenger arrives for the last time in the city with the news that the king's army has crossed the great snowy mountains and reached the territory of the Becher Duchy. Iron says that the day has finally come and gives her men a summary of the situation. The king is on the other side of the river with 40,000 troops after a month of hasty marching. With the troops sent by the nobles, that number could rise to 100,000, while she and her allies have only 20,000. Therefore, once the king crosses the great river, they will have no chance of defending themselves. However, Gregory says they still have a chance because numbers are not everything. He says that the king's soldiers are exhausted from the march and, if delayed, the river will overflow due to rain, so he does not have the advantage of weather. Additionally, they are not familiar with the terrain and the muddy bank. Iron says there is nothing that can overcome them, as she tells them that she sent people to both sides of the river a long time ago. So all they have to do is break the bank before the king can consolidate and crush him in one blow. She says it is the best time to attack, and only by capturing the king can they win the battle, so she asks her uncles to accompany her. Felder says that of course they will, as they are in the same boat now. Then Abby tells Iron that the protagonist did not appear after the alarm, and she tells her to forget about it for now because he will go to the battlefield only voluntarily. Abby also tells her that Shelly woke up and told them that Jones knows black magic capable of manipulating people's hearts, and that he is not human, which surprises Iron. In a scene change, the tavern customers wonder why the protagonist is still there after the alarm went off when the cat appears and throws something at the protagonist. He tells him that he mistreated the drunkard, who lost everything by giving him money and now holds a grudge. The protagonist responds that he is only fulfilling his vows, but he does not understand why it ended up like this. So the cat tells him that the human world is very complicated and gives him the example of a courtesan who is being bothered, who he will probably lose his job if he helps, just like a musician who is being humiliated. The protagonist says he does not want that, but he does not know what to do. The cat responds that no one really knows, which is why there are so few good knights like him. Then Catherine remembers the words she said to the protagonist, and as the battle approaches, she wonders what he will choose. The protagonist arrives riding to Iron's camp and asks where he is, as he has to tell her something important. The soldiers tell him, and he hurries, but they realize that his horse is not Tenidos. The protagonist arrives at Iron's, who thinks he couldn't waste the opportunity to make a reputation in battle. But when she asks him what he has to report, he doesn't answer, so she tells him to just wait there. Suddenly, he pulls out a knife and stabs her. He then tells the soldiers to burn all the boats so that they have no way to cross the river, and she curses as it was a miscalculation. The man turns out to be an impostor impersonating the protagonist, who mocks Iron for having someone with an unknown face at her service who can easily approach her, as it was very easy for him to infiltrate. The soldiers finish burning the boats, so the impostor agrees to release her, as if she dies, the war will be lost, and that's not what the king wants. He then throws Iron at them and escapes by jumping off the cliff with the soldiers chasing him. Abby kneels next to Iron and tells her that she won't let anything happen to her, but she says she won't die because it's just a minor cut, and she asks Abby to find the true protagonist. In a scene change, we see him leaving the tavern confused, while apologizing to Tenidos for not understanding living beings well, and he asks the cat what they do when they are confused. The cat tells him that they usually sleep, but he can't because he's a Lich, so the cat tells him he has to figure it out himself. When troops from Iron surround him and accuse him of being the impostor, he says it's a misunderstanding, but the soldiers tell him it will be seen in jail and arrest him. The protagonist waits inside the jail when the cat arrives and tells him he found out why he was arrested. The cat tells him that someone impersonated him to kill Iron and made them burn the boats, causing panic in the city. Nobody knows if it's him or the impersonator. The protagonist becomes indignant and says he must get out as soon as possible to explain it to his lady. When Iron arrives escorted by her guards and asks for an explanation, the protagonist tells her he is not the impostor, and she asks for some way to prove it. He suggests giving her a dance, but the cat scolds him for it and asks if he wants to remove his helmet. However, Iron says he is the real one, which pleases the protagonist, but the cat says it doesn't make sense. The guards release the protagonist, and he says he will arrest the impostor to apologize to her. But she tells him there is no need, and he must stay in the castle to take care of Shelly and keep an eye on Felder and Jones. The protagonist says he wants to help her in the war, but she tells him he will help her more if he does nothing, as everyone is afraid of not being able to recognize the real one. The protagonist says his chivalry won't allow him to watch his lady go to battle alone, but she yells that she doesn't need his chivalry since it won't help her achieve victory, and without her, it is worthless, so she only needs him to stay in the castle without running around. And the protagonist says he understands. In a scene change, Shelly meets the protagonist, who tells her he knows the situation is a lost cause and asks her what she did to make Iron confine her best weapon to the castle. The protagonist tells her that he wanted to fulfill his vows, but she no longer believes in him, in addition to helping everyone he met. But he's not sure if his actions helped or hurt them, and he doesn't understand the meaning of the oath he took when he was named a knight. But Shelly tells him that even though the situation is confusing, he helped her and her family, and in her heart, he is the best knight. The protagonist thanks her and wants to ask more questions, but Shelly says she's not very good with them. So if he really has a dilemma in his heart, she suggests he visit the church. We see someone attempting to throw a hook at the wall but failing, and the guards barely notice the sound. We see that it is the father, who thinks that the city walls are too high to climb, and that he should have gone with the others after being informed of the war, when suddenly the protagonist appears behind him and startles him. The father asks him what he's doing there, and the protagonist tells him that he's confused, so he'd like to seek his guidance. In a scene change, an explorer tells Iron that the king's army has begun crossing the river, and they manage to avoid their surveillance to ferry soldiers and supplies to the shore. She says they can't let them land, when another explorer alerts her that they also spotted the king's army to the northwest, and that Felder's men have mutinied and are gathering with the king. To which she asks if they're kidding her, since Felder was under arrest in the city and told the protagonist to watch him and Jones. While we see these two escape, Gregory tells Iron to retreat to the city to defend themselves. But she says that will only trap them inside and make the city people suffer, so she orders them to stay in position to intercept the army from the northwest, while she fights in the northeast to prevent the king from landing and capturing him. Back in the church, the protagonist tells the father that he doesn't know if he should continue to believe in chivalry, because according to his oath, he should have gone to help Iron, but he couldn't disobey his order to stay in the castle, and ruined everything by strictly following the knight's oath, which is not as literal as it seems. And all of that has him confused, while we see the beginning of the battle. The father tells him he understands, but there is nothing or no one in the world that is accepted by everyone, and it's normal to be confused because he still can't see the real, which is his own heart. He tells him that the world is gray, which makes it hard to distinguish between black and white, so the answer is that he only needs to obey his own heart, because even though he may not always do the right thing, and not everyone benefits from his help, this will be his decision, and there will always be someone who will show him gratitude. That he shouldn't think of chivalry as a cage, but believe in it and understand it, because the world would be wonderful if everyone had that kind of faith. While we see Iron spot the king and shout that she will crush him, as the father finishes by saying that the moment he follows his heart, his actions will themselves demonstrate the best interpretation of chivalry. The protagonist ponders, while the father hopes he understood because he doesn't even know what he's saying anymore. Then the protagonist says he understood and asks if he can ask another question. The father says yes, and then the protagonist asks him what the difference is between the undead and the living. So he prefers to give him an example, while we see the children waking up each other. He asks him if someone who has stolen countless times is good or bad, and the protagonist says that he is bad. Then he asks the same thing, but if that thief only attacks the rich to give the money to the poor, to which the protagonist says that would be good. So the father tells him that the same thing happens with the living and the undead. The important thing is the heart. and as long as the intention of goodness is maintained, the undead and the living are not different, which the protagonist seems to understand. So he asks the father if he was trying to escape the city, and he says yes, because the king will launch an attack that Iron cannot stop. So the protagonist leaves immediately, and he meets the children on the way out, to whom the father tells them to return to the church, but they tell him that they are knights willing to fight by his side. This makes the protagonist proud, and he takes them into battle with him, when he encounters more guards who attack him because they believe he is the impostor. There they tell him that he killed the guards and freed Felder and Jones. This makes the protagonist furious, who says that if he doesn't get rid of that guy before going to Iron, it will be a problem later. And he wonders if it's so fun to pretend to be him, so it's almost time for him to get angry. In a scene change, an explorer alerts the impostor that pursuers are after them. But when he asks how many, the explorer says it's only one, but it's the protagonist. Jones then says they must finish him off as soon as possible, or he will never stop. So the convoy stops and prepares to intercept the protagonist, who wonders why they're not running anymore. He tells the impostor to reveal his name. The impostor feels a strong sense of oppression coming from the protagonist and removes his helmet, saying he heard he defeated 50 knights, and his strength could be considered unprecedented in the world. But he asks what he can do against 4 times as many elite warriors. Meanwhile, a troop of soldiers surrounds the protagonist. The impostor tells him he's the captain of the king's shadow guard, called Shadow One. This surprises the cat, who says they came prepared, and asks the protagonist what he will do. He replies that he will run straight at them, and the cat says he's now a determined fool, so it's time to hit them head on. They charge against the soldiers with a surprise attack. Shadow One orders a formation of spearmen, and Tenitos says he caused him many problems in the past. But now that he's undead, it doesn't matter, and he pierces through the soldiers. One of them catches the protagonist with a lasso, but he only gets sent flying. Shadow One says the protagonist gets angry like a hurricane. Tenitos spots the impostor. It is against the protagonist, but he's knocked down with one blow. He says he destroyed his internal organs despite wearing armor, and is surprised that he's the real protagonist. He asks him to kill him as he failed, but he says he doesn't kill people, and only seeks for him to apologize to Iron and her warriors. Shadow One thinks he's joking and that there's no sense in apologizing in a war, but the protagonist tells him he's serious. Then, Jones says he's had enough and that they're a group of losers, so he gets out of the carriage saying he's reached the limit of his patience and everyone will die. Suddenly, he starts stealing everyone's life force, while Felder says to wait because he promised them immortality. The cat asks what that black mist is, and the protagonist tells him it's black magic. Jones reveals that he was the one who always wanted to take over the Duchy of Becher, a noble descendant of Dracula, for whom even the strongest humans like the protagonist are garbage, and that he will go to hell with his pathetic chivalry. Some time ago, we see Jones reading a story about Dracula, who welcomed a guest to his castle. The boy says that only those like his ancestor can be considered true bloods. Then Dora arrives and tells him that his parents asked how long he will be away from home before returning. He tells her that he will not run away from home, but instead will take over a castle like his ancestors and then conquer the world. Dora tells him that there is already a castle at home, but he says that he does not want to live there, but in a big one with many servants, and that he has already planned everything to go to the human world, where he will find a noble with white hair and pretend to be his son, and he will take over the castle by killing all of his heirs. Then we return to the present, where Jones asks the protagonist if he still wants to be his father, while throwing a powerful energy ray at him. It hits him directly, and Jones mocks him, telling him that he told him not to mess with him, and that it is a shame that no one is there to witness his death. The protagonist coughs, and the cat asks him if he is okay, when suddenly the armor dissolves, and the protagonist emerges from it. Then the corpses of the soldiers begin to rise, and the protagonist asks if he is serious about no one knowing what happened that day, while we see that everyone is now under his control. This scares Jones, who asks what a Lich is doing there. Dawn arrives at the battlefield, and Horace asks Iron if she is okay. She says she still resists and asks how many men they have left. Horace replies that they lost the cavalry and have less than 2,000 infantrymen left in the last camp. So, if they retreat further, they will have to return to the city. Then Gregory arrives and asks where the protagonist is and why he hasn't appeared. She tells him that he stayed in the castle, and he says that it is of great strategic value. But she responds that it does not matter because they have already lost due to the overwhelming difference in numbers. So Gregory says he will surrender to the king because he cannot let him ruin his family with her. Then panic begins to spread in the city, and we see Shelly trying to leave to go with her grandfather, who says the protagonist can accompany her. but the guards tell her that they saw him leave the city, and she says that he would never run away from battle. Meanwhile, we see that the protagonist defeated Jones, and that's how the second part of this manhwa ends. If you have made it this far in the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to get here, so comment the word Paladin in the comments. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.